Good evening and welcome to the Berean Coffee House. My name is Kevin Short. I'm a Christian philosopher of religion. Here we talk about faith, life, a bit of our culture, all from within a Christian worldview. Why Berean? Because Bereans' nobility was found in the fact that they both believed, but also were willing to investigate. Why Coffee House? Because the English Coffee House was important in spreading the English and Scottish Enlightenment, and I hope my small efforts are able to provide something very similar to what that function was. Now, I originally wanted to move on to a series I've been planning, and I'm going to segue into that just a little bit. But unfortunately, with some changes and turns in events, I think I still need to address the Charlie Kirk assassination just a little bit. I'm not completely comfortable doing that. I was not a big follower of Charlie Kirk. I really didn't know much about who he was before the assassination. I had known he was considered responsible for shifting many in Gen Z to the Trump orbit, but I had not even been aware he was an advocate for Christianity. In fact, what little I knew about him actually seemed to imply something very different. Now, Al Mohler has explained this on the briefing in noting that Charlie Kirk, like many Americans and many individuals, was a bit of a work in progress, especially in his early years. Don't forget that he began his work when he was 18 years old, and, well, if people note that his language could be a little extreme at times, let's take his age into account for that. It is typical for people who are younger to speak with a lot more certainty than perhaps their age should allow them to speak with any authority. But in the wake of the assassination, we've seen something I discussed last week, attacks on freedom of speech by Trump. And this is something that personally I cannot agree with, and many other on the right have refreshingly also agreed with me. I've seen a number of people denounce statements made by Pam Bondi, our current head of our Justice Department, who was stating she was going to go after people over hate speech. Now, Ms. Bondi clarified her point and implied that she was talking about threats and things like that. Personally, that does not match her earlier statements, and quite frankly, those earlier statements should have led to her being removed from her position, which has not happened. But I was at least delighted to see that Trump has not completely infected the Republican Party with the anti-free speech and the tendency to clamp down on opposition. That tends to be a left-wing rather than a right-wing idea, and Trump brings many left-wing ideas into the American right, and I personally think that's dangerous. But the most important speech discussion we've had this week has been at least a temporary suspension, originally the firing, of Jimmy Kimmel from his late-night TV show. There are some indications that this was done because of pressure from the FCC, the Federal Communications Group. But there are also some indications that no actual pressure was put on Disney and that Jimmy Kimmel might have been let go, not because the government censored him, but because Kimmel was himself a liability. And there's a big reason to understand this. Jimmy Kimmel, like most of the late-night talk show hosts today, is losing audience. His platform has grown smaller and smaller, but the rates that the ABC has to collect from advertisers to keep his show on the air hasn't gone down, and he hasn't taken a pay cut. And so if you're ABC, Jimmy Kimmel right now is more of a liability than an asset. And so when he says something incredibly stupid, then, and it leads to massive public outcry, sometimes the damage to the ratings can be so high that it is better to simply walk away than to continue to associate with Jimmy Kimmel. Now, which of these two things happened, I'm not going to say with any specificity what I think actually happened with Jimmy Kimmel. But what's even more interesting, and where I'm going to focus most of my time, is why Jimmy Kimmel got in trouble. Now, Jimmy Kimmel made the statement or implied that MAGA was responsible for the assassination of Charlie Kirk rather than the radical left. And we are seeing those on the left in denial about a serious problem with the extreme left. We have seen this not only from Jimmy Kimmel, but from figures like Bill Maher, who basically said, well, no, the shooter wasn't MAGA, but he really wasn't a left-winger either, which is false. And we're seeing this from others who have tried to distance the shooting of Charlie Kirk from political views. We've also seen a few talking heads who have been rather nonplussed to have their own rhetoric, something I discussed last time, being used as indicating that they are somewhat culpable. And that is something that I agree they are culpable for, as I noted last time, in much the same way I believe that Trump was culpable for January the 6th, at least morally, not necessarily legally. When you start accusing people of being Nazis or fascists, and young people start believing you, and they start becoming high on their own propaganda, then unfortunately violence is going to follow. And even a Christian philosopher, though one who sadly has done very little lately in the field that he at least showed some great promise in, has fallen for claims from the radical left-wing group Occupy Democrat to imply that this was not a politically motivated shooting. That is, the discussion seems to be that the left is in denial and that this somehow was not political. But I think it is. And by the way, I can also go on to Montel Williams, who got up and said, no, this wasn't about politics, it was about a love story. Nobody would say this if it were a right-winger who tried to assassinate President Obama. But such is the day we live in. Now, I want to discuss this more from the standpoint of some facts. Let's say why I think this is a left-wing violence problem and why this denial ultimately is dangerous. So let's start with a couple of recent findings. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, not precisely a right-wing place, has noted that left-wing violence is on the rise, and 2025 may be the year with the most left-wing based violence since the 1960s, when you had groups like the Weather Underground who were using violence to try and protest the Vietnam War. Now, I'm always very careful on these claims about who is more violent, the left or the right. I think there are a lot of problems when we start making this discussion. This includes how are we categorizing groups, because there's not necessarily a perfect way to do this. As I stated before, the traditional American right and the traditional American left, up until a few years ago, was very different from the European right and left. However, European concepts tend to be more common among sociologists because they tend to be influenced very heavily by continental philosophy. Traditional American conservatives are, technically speaking, liberals, classical liberals. In fact, I have read books by European economists, and along the way, they will deride American conservatives for not calling themselves liberals. And American progressives tended in the 1920s and the 1930s and the 1940s to embrace the extremes of both the left and the right in Europe and tried to combine them. And so some of the ideas used in the New Deal came from places like Germany, were influenced in part by Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union. They kind of looked at all of them and tried to kind of throw things in a hodgepodge. And I think part of this is because, quite frankly, Roosevelt didn't really have a plan. He was winging it all the way, which is one of the reasons why the New Deal never worked. Another thing that we have, so while there are problems with claims about which side are more violent, I think it is fair to say that we are seeing an uptick in left-wing violent extremists, and have since Trump came on the scene. We saw the rise of a terrorist group, recently called a terrorist group, Antifa, whose entire goal was to prevent people from speaking on college campuses. And this is an extremely far-left group, and some of their ideas seem to come from and to have started with Herbert Marcuse's essay, Repressive Tolerance, something I discussed last time, which made the comment that if you are trying to change things, you have to prevent those who are against change. And he puts it in terms of fascism because, of course, those who are on the socialist front tend to misidentify anybody who disagrees with them, and really anybody to the right of Lenin, as being a fascist. Now, not only do we have this poll implying an uptick in left-wing violence, but a YouGov survey has come out that has shown about 25% of those who are very liberal believe that it is sometimes okay to use violence to forward a political agenda, as opposed to about 3% on the far right. So, and interestingly enough, this was higher with those under 45 than those over 45. That part's not really all that surprising. There is a tendency for younger people to move towards the extremes of a political ideology, in large part, I think, because they've just not had the life experience. Age doesn't necessarily make you wise, but I do not believe it is possible to be wise without some experience and without some age. It's unfortunately a necessary prerequisite, even if it is not a sufficient one. But it's very interesting as well to note that if you go online to places like Reddit, you will see precisely the types of extremist thoughts being presented. But you know, all we really need to understand this is the tendency for some on the American left to wear t-shirts with Che Guevara's face on it. This ought to be as shocking to us as someone wearing a shirt with Heinrich Himmler's face on it, because in a lot of ways they're very similar. They're not necessarily the political leaders of a movement, but they're basically the bully boys and the murderous thugs who help carry out extremist agendas. Che Guevara, among other things, tried to push for a launch of missiles, Russian missiles, that were on Cuban soil at the United States. So effectively, he wanted to start a nuclear war. And he was a evil man, evil to the core. And yet, many on the left have long viewed him as a figure worthy of emulation. This leads us to what some people will call the horseshoe theory, and I'm probably going to contradict myself later. But it's the one thing about the political spectrum and the discussion of a political spectrum that I find useful. Many leftists immediately dismiss the horseshoe theory as just, propaganda to prevent the changes in society. But we can actually see how the extremes of the two European opposites tend to bend and become more like each other, in that both become authoritarian and totalitarian, and both begin sending people to concentration camps or the work camps in the Soviet Union. We sometimes call them gulags, something that, by the way, some American leftists now will tend to present apologies for. It's interesting that they do it now when the victims of those camps are mostly dead. But both of these groups, but the extreme right in European terms and the extreme left, tend to take us in the same direction, which is towards violence, towards enforced uniformity, etc. Now, why, though, is a Che Guevara shirt acceptable and a Heinrich Himmler shirt is not? And the answer is because there has been a move among many on the extreme left towards Marx and Marxism, even though there has not been a move towards fascism on the extreme right. This is one of the reasons why I consider those who call Donald Trump a fascist to be just plain nuts. Because we do not see reverence for the figures of fascism the same way we do among the far right for Marx, Lenin, Mao, Trotsky, etc. But we have had on the extreme left a move to Marxism and neo-Marxism. Now, why do I say that is a move? Well, if you will look at our history, many of our left-wing presidents, some of whom were very, very influential on many of our left-wing figures, such as JFK, were ardent anti-communists. Yes, the American left has not always been pro-communist. But today, to be an anti-communist is in and of itself to leave one being charged as being a fascist. Some of this, though, isn't to classical Marxism. Some of this is to something called neo-Marxism. I've recently received some pushback from one person who said he doesn't trust anybody who uses the phrase neo-Marxist. The problem, I think, is I don't know of another term to represent those who are trying to rescue Marx from Lenin and Mao. Usually when I talk about neo-Marxism, I'm talking about the Frankfurt School. Earlier I mentioned the essay Repressive Tolerance, written by Herbert Marcuse. Well, he is one of the leading figures and leading thinkers of the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School attempted to rescue Marx from Lenin and Mao by viewing Marx as being essentially correct, but he needed some tweaking where he was outdated. Part of the problem for many on Marx is Marx, initially at least, did not predict that communism would start with Russia. Now, before somebody says, aha, this proves the Soviet Union wasn't real communism, it should be noted that Lenin had apparently written to Marx at one point, it would have been late in Marx's lifetime and early in Lenin's, but had asked whether certain aspects of the structure of Russia would accommodate his theory, and apparently Marx had said yes. But Lenin did have to adapt Marx a bit to the Soviet experiment. And yet, this wasn't where Marxism was supposed to start. It was supposed to start in England or America or Germany, not in the most backward place of all in the Western European mindset, which was Russia, because, you know, Russia had just released the serfs in a relatively recent time compared to every place else. They were backwards. Almost as much as the Austro-Hungarians, which were the Russians' mortal enemy at the time. But they also felt that Marx was had too much of an emphasis on class and too much of an emphasis on economics rather than other forms of oppression. And so we start to get a sort of pseudo-psychological Freudian analysis of culture and society, which unfortunately has had a wide sweeping negative impact on sociology and psychology as disciplines. But one of the things you find, for example, is that the Frankfurt School tended to be accused rightfully of making pseudo-psychological attacks on those they disagreed with. This is what's given us, for example, our modern oppressor-oppressed dynamic, in which many on the far left tend to measure the world. That is, one is either an oppressor or oppressed, and one can, in fact, be a member of both groups in different ways. And so this is where we have, various alliances and the various different types of critical theory that has developed. But all of this is still within the revolutionary ideas of Marx. And Marx was a very bloody-minded individual. His entire philosophy was about bloody revolutions overthrowing societies. And we should therefore not be all that surprised when Marxists start shooting at people. It's a part of the core commitments that they have. And unfortunately, as I'm seeing it, this is becoming a growing fad on university campuses and therefore with many, many young people. Now, before I finish with this part of the thought, I want to note that this is a religious battle and not a political one. Marxism, in a sense, is a type of political religion. Now, before somebody thinks I'm just trying to engage in propaganda, because Marx himself described religion as the opiate of the people, I am going to defend this in a couple of episodes with where I am going with what is the nature of the debates and the divisions in our society, and I'm going to suggest that they are ethical and they are foundational. But in terms of Marxism, Marxism has long been noted by philosophers of religion as having many of the necessary components of religion, but without a supernatural belief. And I'll discuss why I don't consider that to be a problem. But at a minimum, Marxism, along with a few other political philosophies, are sometimes thought to be political religions. That is, they are seeking heaven, utopia, by means of a secular salvation, but with all of the religious fervor that comes along with it. But they lack certain characteristics of tradition. So sometimes they're called quasi-religions. So at a minimum, Marxism and naturalism, I would argue, and progressivism, and libertarianism, and yes, probably Nazism, although Nazism is a little less unified, show certain characteristics of being political religions that replace God with the state, or in the case of Marxism, with the collective. And they are trying to bring mankind to this next stage, much as Christians seek the kingdom of God. The basic problems, again, are the foundational claims that we have in our ethics. For Christians, we believe that the foundational basis of ethics comes down to God himself as the good. Obviously, a naturalist doesn't think that. There are other systems here. Kant, for example, based his ethics on the idea of the categorical imperative. We have utilitarianism. But all of these are separate parties, separate philosophies, separate foundational principles. And this is where most of our disagreements go. And I'm going to develop this starting next week when I explain what I mean when I describe myself as a Christian philosopher of religion. Because I don't just mean that I am a Christian and a philosopher and that my expertise is in philosophy of religion. I mean that I am a Christian philosopher of religion. But I'll go into that next time. So that's what I think is going on. We have a denial about extreme violence coming out of the extreme left, and that is due to the embrace of Marxism and neo-Marxism among many younger people. But why do I say the denial is dangerous? If you going back last week, I noted that left-wing rhetoric was egging on this kind of thing. You know, when you start describing your political enemies in terms of Hitler and Mussolini and fascism and Nazism and all of these other things, when you start making the kinds of statements about your political opponents like that, where they are portrayed within what is viewed by most Westerners as universal evil, then it is rational for somebody to think our only option is violence. And so what we really need is a cooling of the temperature in the room, but primarily that cooling at the moment, at least, needs to come from the left. Now, I've seen a lot of people making claims that the right needs to turn down the temperature. We saw this right after Charlie Kirk's assassination from at least one or two broadcasters. We've seen this from several other sources who have tried to blame this all on Trump. But Trump's not the one calling the left fascists. He's not the one calling the left Nazis. He's not the one comparing, border policy to the secret police, the cultural genocide, and all of these other things. And so when you use this type of elevated language, you should not be surprised when violence is the result, especially when you have an ideology that is built on the concept that violence is good. And so our only temporary solution to this problem is for the left to lower the temperature of their rhetoric. As I noted, one step in this may be to start treating words like fascists and Nazis as defamation per se, and remember, I noted why that this is not a violation of the principles of free speech. Of course, as a Christian, I'm not on the left, so I can't do this. I can't fix that side of the problem. So, how do we as believers live through a day like this? And the answer is we understand that this is a return to normality. Christians in the West have enjoyed a certain amount of freedom for a fairly long period of time. And unfortunately, those times in many countries are coming to an end, and perhaps it will happen here. I don't know that it will, but we already have Christians being imprisoned for simply quoting the Bible in certain countries of Western Europe. As I noted last week, I always find it rather telling that in places like Germany, they want to make rules to prevent extreme right rhetoric because they don't believe in free speech, but we don't see the same thing for extreme left-wing violence that also calls for violence. So as Christians, we need to understand that this is a return to normal, and our hope is not found in this world, and it is not found in Donald Trump. Now, I've come down pretty hard on the left, but I come down pretty hard on Trump sometimes too. I personally find myself, when it comes to Trump, being a bit perplexed because, even with Obama, I didn't think he was a very good president. In fact, I thought he was horrible in terms of his political philosophy. But there were a few things he did that I thought were appropriate and helpful. I was working at the time as in areas around exports, and some of the changes he made to the export regulations, for example, I thought were probably correct and probably timely, and they were things, quite frankly, that I thought already needed to be done. So, even with Obama, just because I agreed with him on that issue, that didn't necessarily make me an Obama fan. There are issues I agree with Trump. Bizarrely, anytime I agree with Trump, I'm called MAGA, and anytime I disagree with him, I'm generally called a leftist, which is not true. I just happen to be more Reagan than Trump. But our hope is not found in Trump. Our hope has never been found in the Republican Party, and perhaps it's time that we learned that. We should have started learning this in the 90s when we started seeing the Republican Party being willing to work more closely with China and give China most favored nation trading status, despite its abysmal treatment of Christians. So our hope can't be in politics, and our hope can't be in a political figure. Our hope has to be in Christ. And not only must our hope be in Christ, but we need to understand that the problems we're seeing aren't primarily political, they're primarily religious and cultural. Marxism, as I noted, should be treated as a religion. But it's also sold on the basis of an attempt at cultural control and cultural hegemony. And this is something we're going to discuss later. So I didn't want to go into Charlie Kirk. I wanted to go into other stuff. I really felt, though, that on the one hand, this kind of gives me at least a small opening to discuss where we're going instead of just trying to throw it all at you at once. But I think it's also important that we understand why we're having a problem with politically motivated violence, and the fact that it is, at least in this case, a serious escalation in terms of violence from the left. Now, I'm not making the claim that the left is necessarily more violent. Going back to that survey with YouGov, with the acceptability of violence by the left, you also have to remember that people don't always have the courage of their convictions. You know, it's one thing to say, well, you know, somebody needs to kill this leader. It's another thing to say, yeah, I'm going to do it and I'm going to risk imprisonment for the rest of my life or possibly the death penalty. There are also people who act in a way that is not consistent with their beliefs. We see that in many places as well. So my suggestion isn't that the left is necessarily more violent, and I also think we have to look at this in a timely manner. How far back you go, you know, I try not to make an argument about the left and violence from, say, what happened in the 1960s, because quite frankly that wouldn't make sense. We have different issues today. The Vietnam War is over. But we are seeing an uptick in left-wing violence. That much we can know. That much I think we can certainly see. And we do need to respond to it. And I think our response needs to be to call on the left to tone down the extreme language they're using. If you found this useful, even if a little dry at times, I hope you'll hit like and subscribe. My name again was Kevin Short. This has been the Berean Coffee House, and I hope to see you again sometime. Thank you. Bye.